Ken back at Big House Power, representing Dynamic Fitness and Strength today for our new title, Coaching Academy. This is part 3 of our exercise pool development, and today we're going over the last major category, upper body movements. What we'll go over today is the different categories that we utilize and some of the unique ways that I use subcategories to place certain movements. Obviously, the most popular movement ever in the history of lifting weights, the bench press, falls into this. Like I've said on the blog also, we respect upper body movements, but in athletic-based training, I classify that as the third of the 3 from a most important standpoint. I believe total body movements are the most important, lower body is second, and upper body is third. In general pop, go to the gyms, it'll probably be the exact opposite. But today we're going to talk about movement categories, upper body exercise pool. First we're going to start off with, I'll always try to keep things in pairs when we can. So we're going to talk about vertical pulls and presses, horizontal pulls and presses, because as I've developed my organization for program design, I have come to be aware that I will pair all the upper body exercises within a pool as well as add in some type of posterior shoulder movement. So I will pair them together when I can. So what we'll see today is vertical press pulls, horizontal press pulls, flexion and extension work, and then all the various movement patterns of the shoulder and scapular region. So at first we're going to start off with horizontal movements. Presses, pulls. And we'll start off with what I call the bilateral work. When I talk about pure bilateral work with the upper body work, it's generally going to be barbell work or machines that don't have the ability to do independent limbs. Primary barbell work will be your presses, it will be your bench press, obviously, and we can go down the line, the various bars. How you're going to change the bench press and variations is type of bar you use as well as the grip. In the mid-90s, I wrote an article for Powerlifting USA that we established a 6-grip program for our athletes to use. Our standard grip, when we would test our athletes, was what we called the grip 2, which is a full thumb from the inside knurl where the smooth was. That was our traditional grip. And then we'd make adjustments based off individual differences from there. Further out, the numbers increased. Further in was a tighter grip. For example, grip 6, closed grip, was 2 fingers on the smooth, to get an idea. Competition grip was your max grip, where your pointer finger was on the knurl ring, and that was the maximal grip allowed in a competitive bench press situation. So when you talk about your bench press work or your horizontal pressing work, and it all starts off the bench, and you can add incline in there also, everything will be varied by the grip you use and the type of bar. There's numerous bars out there. I think the most popular are the log bars, neutral grip bar, and then the variations of people would call a Swiss bar or a football bar. What you will also notice is there'll be a far more variety of presses than there will be in pulls. And one of the things I want to talk about, the traditional, most common barbell row or pull is the bent over row. The problem with this in an athletic-based setting is we have bastardized that movement with terrible technique.
It says pause due to poor connection, reconnecting. It didn't cut off.
we're talking again about the bent over barbell row and how that's a tough movement for most athletes. Most of the problem lies with the athlete isn't strong enough in their posterior chain or their root or core of the abdominal section to stabilize the load in a bent over position. And this becomes where the athlete becomes to get more upright as they fatigue, put too much stress on the low back, and it does not become the pure horizontal row that most people want. And that is why several companies have made prone row benches. And then what we used to do is we would have the athlete use a lighter load and then put their head on an incline bench to help keep the back in a good position. A great alternative to that when we're talking about bars is doing some dead stop work that Glenn Penley made popular, the former Olympic weightlifting coach, but we've started to do it with high handle trap bars that actually help the athlete in a better position to do a bilateral row. So when we talk about horizontal movements, we've got presses and pulls, we've got our bench press work with the various bars, and our barbell work. One thing I will also say is, again, we've talked about this. Most people want to stay in a free weight attacked approach when it comes to training athletes, and I agree with that. But when it comes to the supplemental movements of the upper body, there's almost guaranteed that you're going to need some type of horizontal row or vertical row machine to utilize in your programming. And that's why you will predominantly see some type of lat pull down and seated row machines in most universities, colleges, high school, and professional settings. So we have our variations of the horizontal movements, bilateral, specific, barbell work. Now what happens is here, we also consider these bilateral movements, but I call dumbbell work bilateral independent limb movements because the loads are independently supported in each limb. And when I call it bilateral is because traditionally most people will do dumbbell overhead presses and or bench presses in a double bilateral arm independent limb action. So I classify that slightly different. I will call that bilateral independent limb. And that's all your dumbbell movements. And we can combine these. Let's go horizontal movements and vertical. Let's move right into that. I'm jumping ahead. Presses, pulls. Here we have all our overhead work. Here we have our chin-ups, pull-ups, and those variations, as well as our pull-down variations. And the same thing occurs with some of the machine work and the pull-down work. You will have an opportunity to do bilateral independent limb work. So for example, the differences between a bilateral independent limb work and then what I call a pure independent limb is there is no external load in one of the limbs. That limb is used for bracing and anchoring point to help in stabilizing the body position. I don't have a bench available, so we'll do a difference of what a bilateral independent limb work looks like for an overhead press versus what a pure independent limb work looks like. So in the case if I'm doing what I would call a bilateral independent limb shoulder press, we would have the dumbbells up in this position here, and both would be in movement at the same succession. And even if I changed it up where I went alternate, still both hands are loaded. The difference with the pure independent limb is I'm going to anchor and brace one side of the body with the off hand that doesn't have external load, and I'm going to stabilize the body and then engage the press with a single arm. So that's how I differentiate those two subcategories. So when you're looking at horizontal movements and vertical movements, we always are going to try to pair a press with a pull, and we'll get more in depth with this as we continue to build out our program design model. Press and pull vertical. Bilateral independent limb work is your dumbbell variations, your kettlebell variations, as well as now your center mass bell variations, if you have those in your gym. Then you will work on different hand positionings with the kettlebell, bell down, bell up. So there's numerous ways you're going to increase your package for the exercise pool. Then you have your pure independent limb work, and again, that is where the load is in one particular limb, and then the opposite limb is used for bracing. So we've covered a large majority in a short period of time of all what I call the big movements of the upper body movement category. And you want to experiment with your program design with barbell and dumbbell movements. It changes the range of motion, it changes the way the muscles are activated, and you do want to work in both horizontal and vertical planes. One of my biggest pet peeves with programming that emphasizes the Olympic lifts, and especially at a younger age with the overhead lifts, is we're getting a lot of issues with shoulders when we get these kids in college with scapular and shoulder issues because they've snatched and jerked and they've never developed pure strength by doing standard overhead pressing and or vertical rows to complement that from a stabilization choice. So if you are going to use overhead Olympic lifts in your programs, you have to. I'm mandating it. That's right. I'm mandating that you do some type of overhead standard pressing for absolute maximal strength and some pull down chin up and rows from a vertical plane. Now the most complex movements of the upper body come from the shoulder and scapular region. These are primarily isolation work, and again, a lot of people talk, there's no room for isolation work in athletics. The older I've gotten and the more I've worked with higher level athletes, it is a necessity that this stuff finds ways in your program, especially in the shoulder region. So we've classified that as a separate entity, shoulder and scapular movement category. And again, as I was going through my own notes for today, I wrote these down so I wouldn't miss any. But here is the numerous movements that occur, and you have to find ways to train throughout a weekly plan to protect the shoulder and scapular region of the body. First, shoulder. You have flexion, extension, and hyperextension. Flexion, extension, hyperextension. Horizontal ab and adduction. Ab and adduction. Circumduction. You have internal, external, medial rotation. Lateral and medial rotation. I like to call these goalposts and these 90-90s. From the scapular region, elevation and depression, typical shrug movement. Shoulder elevation, drive down, shoulder depression, and then retraction and protraction. Retract, pinching the scaps together, protract, big reach. All of these movements to have a free-flowing scapula, especially that will definitely help your pressing movements and your pulls and your big lifts, but also most sports, the shoulder is very viable to injury concerns. For you not to emphasize some type of movement throughout the week for the various different ways that the shoulder and scap operates, you're doing your athletes a disservice. If you continue to tell people and I'm talking about coaches and administrators, that your ultimate goal with your program is to reduce injury, and you don't account for this in the shoulder mobility work, then you're doing yourself a disservice to your athletes, and it's kind of hypocritical. So again, isolation movements do have an effect, a positive one, in the development of athletes in an athletic-based strength training program. We just have to find ways to get them in. And again, I will tell you this at all times. I made these mistakes coming up. It was always prime movers. We were doing so much prime movers, we weren't working the antagonistic muscle groups, and we're still coming up with ticky-tack issues with the shoulder and pec. As we get further into development of steps and reps, you should always outclass yourselves with more pulls than presses. We use a standard +2, so for every rep we do for a press, we're going to do 2 + 2 reps for a pull. So if I'm doing a set of 8 on the bench, I'm guaranteed to do a set of 10 for that corresponding pull. Some people even go higher than that, and in certain exercises we do that also. But we do more posterior work than anterior work, so overall volume from front to back is in our favor. But again, shoulder scap movements cannot be overlooked. It's a very good time for you to put this in your programming once you've established how you want to work that in your pre or post workout routine after your main session is done. And again, I'll repeat those again for you. We have flexion and extension and hyperextension. Horizontal ab and adduction, and then ab and adduction. Internal and external medial rotation, lateral and medial rotation. The differences are internal, external is what I call 90-90. Lateral and medial is up in your goalpost or a W. Circumduction, forward and back. And then the shoulder work. Elevation and depression, your typical shrug work. Retraction, pinching the scaps together. Protraction, big reaches. And a lot of that work, I will be honest with you, a lot of the posterior work of the shoulder will work into our neck and trap circuit. So we'll cover a lot of these small movements in our pre-work and in our next circuit. And that's a great way you guys can think about putting that in with your athletes. And then finally, we have our flexion and extension work. Again, arms. Now, from a female standpoint, not too critical, but most athletes on the male side are all about the show muscles on game day and the arms. What I will tell you is, and Matt Wenning says that you got to earn the right to do biceps, but you can never not do enough triceps. And when you're thinking about most movements in athletics, there's some type of horizontal press that's going to occur depending on the plane. Whether it's two offensive and a defensive lineman engaging, or a basketball player with a chest pass, those things are important. And to build pure pressing strength, the tricep cannot be overlooked. If you look at professional powerlifters and professional lifters who now use supportive shirts to help them generate more weight in a 1 rep max, those supportive gear actually helps the athlete catapult the bar off the chest, but then the triceps have to take over the finish. That's why you see a tremendous amount of competitive powerlifters who use supportive gear do a lot of heavy board press work and specific tricep work, because those supportive gear does not take over once that you lose the pressing power and it falls into the triceps. Also, it teaches you how to pull the bar down in a row to fire off the press when we talk more about exercise technique. But the triceps cannot be overlooked. Most of the time, athletes will miss the weight at their mini max or a sticking point, or they're just not strong enough to get it off their chest. When you get stuck here, that's where your triceps and lockout strength come into play. We cannot ever emphasize tricep work when it comes to athletic-based strength training. And then the bicep is just the antagonistic muscle that we will do so that we balance out the upper arm. And then finally, you have your forearm and grip work. everybody's doing some type of forearm and grip work, it looks like, as a finisher. Whether it's plate holds for distance or time, whether it's rope hangs, or using ropes for their pull-ups and chin-up work. That stuff is good, great movement stuff for finishers and competitions at the end of workouts. So again, the upper body stuff is a lot faster to go over than the total body and the lower body, but just as important to fill out your whole body training sessions. So again, in review, your upper body movements. You're going to have horizontal plane movements and vertical plane movements. That generally will dominate your programming. From there, you have pure bilateral work, which is barbell or stable machines without independent action. Then we talk about bilateral independent limb work. That's your dumbbell work where both arms are working at the same time. Then we have our pure individual limb work. That's where one arm is a stabilizer and an anchor, and then the other arm is loaded and doing the work. We have the numerous movements of the shoulder and scap work, isolation work that has to be done in an athletic-based strength training program. Then you have your flexion and extension of the elbow, which again, you have to balance out the body, so you're going to do flexion and extension work, but you want to prioritize the extension and the work of the triceps. And then as a finisher, it's always good to work the flexor extensor of the wrist and forearm and your grip. This is it for Joe Kenn this week. On Monday, we will have our one-on-one live with Josh Storms of Florida State. And then the week after that, on Monday, I've just confirmed, we have a high school strength coach of the year, Eric Cash from Dorman High, coming on. And what we will work on this week is finding out the best way to progress from the 3 movement categories into the next development of your exercise pool, which is now classifying these exercises as far as foundational type movements, supplemental movements, major assistance movements, as well as secondary assistance movements. So I will start getting to work on it. I will look at what we've got on the clipboard. I will look at what we got on the notes. We will have up shortly on both my site and the Dynamic site last week's work on lower body movements, and we will also start editing this week's upper body program that you saw today. Again, thank you for your time.
We have one question from JM Tower U. What about one arm with no anchor load?
Where would my question return would be, where are we putting that arm to stabilize? Again, that's your choice. This is my choice. Anyone can make up what they want in their exercise pools how you see fit. I prefer to have the arm anchored rather than just dangling. So it's either going to be braced here for a vertical movement, or I'm generally going to have them place it on their belly button for a horizontal pressing movement while you're lying on a bench. Thank you again. We'll see you all next week.
Here and there, but